Jennifer sat alone in the quiet hum of her corner office, staring at the crumpled, coffee-stained application sitting on her pristine glass desk. Out of 3,000 resumes submitted for the new Apex Logistics facility, this was the only one applying for the lowest-paid janitor position. The applicant had crossed out the expected salary box entirely. In its place, scribbled in faded blue ink, were just 6 words: "Need mornings for my little girl." Her vice president had already tossed it in the trash, calling it a waste of time. But Jennifer carefully smoothed out the crinkled paper. Her manicured fingers trembled as she read the name printed at the very top, Mike Turner. She swallowed hard. The smartest man she had ever met, the one who had saved her future 10 years ago, was now begging to mop her floors. 4:30 a.m. The alarm didn't ring because Mike was already awake. In the dim glow of the kitchen light, he stood perfectly still, listening. From the bedroom down the narrow hallway, a soft, raspy cough echoed against the cheap walls. Lily, his 7-year-old daughter, shifted in her sleep. Mike exhaled slowly and picked up the small plastic asthma inhaler sitting on the countertop. He gave it a gentle shake. It was almost empty. Next to it, pinned beneath a rusty magnet on the refrigerator door, was an invoice from the hospital. The bold black numbers at the bottom read $25,000. Mike Turner wasn't supposed to be here. 10 years ago, he was the sharpest mind in his university's mathematics department. He could solve complex algorithms in his head faster than a computer could boot up. But life doesn't run on math. It runs on choices. And when Lily's mother walked out, leaving him with an infant and a mountain of medical debt, Mike made his choice. The scent of slightly burnt toast filled the cramped kitchen. He carefully sliced a sandwich, packing it into Lily's pink lunchbox with geometric precision. Every corner aligned, every item placed perfectly to save space. It was the only thing he could control right now. He didn't have $25,000. He didn't even have $25 to spare. What he did have was a worn-out gray jacket and a need to survive. He needed a job that paid immediately, one that didn't demand his mental energy, so he could bring his full self home to his little girl. He wasn't going to solve equations today. He was just trying to survive. That afternoon, the phone rang. It wasn't HR. It was the CEO herself. Jennifer sat across from Mike in her spacious corner office. The contrast between them was glaring. She wore a tailored designer suit radiating authority. He wore his faded gray jacket, his posture guarded. On the glass table between them sat his crumpled application right next to a crisp, freshly printed employment offer. "I don't understand," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mike, you saved my academic career. You tutored me when I was failing out. You have the most brilliant mind I've ever encountered. Why are you applying to push a mob?" Mike stared at the offer letter. It was for a senior operations analyst position. The salary was $45,000 a year. It was enough to start paying down the hospital bills. It was a lifeline. "I appreciate the offer, Jennifer." "Truly," Mike said, his voice low and steady. "But I read the job description. It requires standard office hours. It requires sudden overtime. It requires me to be on call." "It's a corporate job, Mike. That's how it works," she replied, her eyes widening in confusion. "And that's why I can't take it," he said, pushing the contract back across the glass. "My daughter has severe asthma. When she has an attack, I have to be there. I can't be stuck in a boardroom. I need a job where I can clock in at night, do the heavy lifting, and leave the stress at the door. I need to be completely free during the day for Lily." Jennifer looked at him, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. She was offering him a ticket back to the life he deserved, but he was choosing the dirt and the grind. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "More than anything," Mike replied. He stood up, gave her a polite nod, and turned toward the door. She watched the smartest man she knew willingly walk into the shadows. He walked out of the corner office and picked up a mop. His first shift started at midnight. The Apex Logistics warehouse was a massive concrete beast, echoing with the hum of conveyor belts and forklifts. In the dimly lit locker room, Mike opened a rusted metal locker. The hinges squeaked in protest. He carefully took out a folded crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands, using a piece of tape to stick it to the inside of the door. He stared at it for a moment, letting Lily's messy scribbles anchor his resolve. "Hey, you're the new guy," a harsh voice barked. Mike turned. Brad, the floor manager, stood in the doorway. He was a heavy-set man with a clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. His leather boots clicked loudly against the concrete floor as he marched over. Without warning, Brad kicked Mike's mop bucket, sending dirty water sloshing over Mike's worn-out sneakers. "I don't care who hired you. Down here you belong to me," Brad sneered, stepping intentionally on the handle of Mike's mop. "You miss a single spot on aisle 4, and you're out on the street." "Understood." Mike's jaw tightened. God, he wanted to walk out. He wanted to shove the manager aside and walk right out the front door. But then he saw his daughter's face in his mind. He heard that raspy cough. He saw the $25,000 invoice. Mike slowly knelt down, picked up the mop from under Brad's boot and wrung it out in the bucket. He didn't say a word. He just started cleaning. Brad chuckled, satisfied that he had broken the new guy so quickly, and walked away. As the sound of Brad's boots faded, a shadow fell over Mike. An older janitor with silver hair and a weathered face pushed a heavy trash cart past him. He stopped, leaning heavily against the cart. "Don't let him get in your head," the old man said gently. "My name's William." Mike looked up, gripping the mop handle. William offered a warm, knowing smile. "They can make us clean the dirt, son, but they can't make us dirty." 2:15 a.m. The breaking point. The Apex Logistics warehouse floor was a sprawling labyrinth of towering metal racks, concrete pillars, and narrow aisles that seemed to stretch into infinity. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless, maddening hum. Mike was mopping near loading bay 3, the rhythmic swish of wet cotton against concrete his only company, when he heard it. A high-pitched metallic squeal echoed down the main corridor. It sounded like metal grinding violently against metal. William, the older janitor with the silver hair, was struggling to push a rusted industrial trash cart around a sharp corner. The cart weighed easily 200 pounds. Its front caster wheels were completely locked, dragging a deep black scuff mark against the polished concrete. William's face was flushed. A dangerous shade of red and heavy beads of sweat were dripping down his deeply lined forehead, stinging his eyes. Suddenly, the old man erupted into a violent fit of coughing. He stumbled forward, his knees buckling under the sheer weight. He barely caught himself against the edge of the heavy steel bin, gasping for air. Mike dropped his mop. The wooden handle clattered loudly on the floor as he sprinted over. He grabbed the front handle of the cart just before it tipped backward, pulling it upright with a heavy grunt. The muscles in his arms strained against the massive weight. "You okay, William?" Mike asked, his voice laced with concern, steadying the older man by the shoulder. William nodded weakly, pressing a trembling hand to his chest as he desperately tried to catch his breath. Just out of breath, son," he wheezed. "Brad's got us on a new quota system. If we don't clear all 4 sectors by 3 a.m., he docks our pay." Mike frowned, his brow furrowing. He looked down at the route William was trying to take. It made absolutely no sense. He walked over to the employee bulletin board near the break room where Brad had proudly pinned the new cleaning matrix. It was a catastrophic mess. The printed schedule forced the janitorial staff to zigzag back and forth across the 1 million square foot facility, deliberately backtracking through areas they had already cleaned just to empty secondary bins. It ignored momentum. It ignored basic geometry. It was a mathematical nightmare. The system wasn't broken. It was just designed by someone who never had to push a cart. Mike didn't go back to his scheduled 15-minute break. While the rest of the exhausted crew sat in the dimly lit lounge, drinking stale, lukewarm coffee, he stood alone in front of that board. His eyes darted across the warehouse blueprints. Numbers, variables, friction coefficients, and distances began to click into place in his mind. He was no longer just a man in a faded gray jacket holding a mop. For those 10 minutes, he was the brilliant mathematician who could bend complex algorithms to his will. The next night, Mike arrived for his shift 15 minutes early. The warehouse was mostly empty, still transitioning from the day crew. Near the shipping pallets, he found exactly what he was looking for: a broken piece of white chalk discarded by a forklift driver. He didn't make a grand announcement to the team. He didn't walk into Brad's office demanding recognition. Instead, he quietly walked the vast floor. At every major intersection of the warehouse, Mike knelt down in the shadows and drew a tiny, almost invisible white arrow on the concrete. Using the mathematical model he had built in his head the night before, he optimized the sharp right angles into sweeping diagonal shortcuts. He calculated the exact turning radius needed to keep the heavy cart's momentum going. deliberately reducing the friction on the rusted wheels. He rerouted the flow of foot traffic so that no janitor ever had to cross the same path twice. When the midnight shift officially started, the older crew members unknowingly began following his subtle marks. William pushed his heavy cart toward aisle 7, saw a small chalk arrow pointing toward a narrow service corridor he usually ignored, and decided to take it. The result was immediate and undeniable. The screeching of dragging wheels stopped, replaced by a smooth, continuous roll. The exhausting, frustrating backtracking vanished entirely. By 2:30 a.m., the entire floor was completely spotless. They had finished the punishing cleaning quota a full 30% faster than ever before. In the break room, the crew sat around, bewildered, enjoying an impossible extra half hour of rest. William wiped his brow, a deeply relieved smile on his face, though he had absolutely no idea why the night had felt so effortless. His chest wasn't burning. His knees weren't aching. Mike sat quietly in the far corner, nursing a cup of cold water. He retreated into the shadows, a quiet, profound satisfaction settling deep in his chest. His genius mind, once praised by Ivy League professors and sought after by tech firms, was now being used solely to optimize garbage collection. And he didn't care. He didn't care at all, because it kept an old man from collapsing on the cold floor. But secrets in a billion-dollar building never stay hidden for long. What Mike didn't know was who was watching the security cameras. Brad had immediately noticed the impossible spike in efficiency. The arrogant floor manager had spent his entire morning locked in his office reviewing the surveillance footage. He fast-forwarded through hours of tape until he zoomed in on the grainy video of the new janitor kneeling down in the dark and scribbling on the floor. Brad didn't confront Mike. He didn't ask how a janitor had managed to fix a logistical nightmare. Instead, he took a wet rag, walked the floor, and personally wiped away every single chalk mark Mike had drawn. He then sat at his computer, shamelessly copied Mike's exact routing system, printed it on official company letterhead, and slapped his own name in bold letters at the top. At the end of the week, the vice president of operations visited the facility for a surprise inspection. He stood in the middle of the warehouse floor, surrounded by executives holding Brad's newly printed map. "This new logistical routing is absolutely outstanding, Brad," the VP said loudly, making sure the nearby warehouse workers heard every word. "You've cut janitorial overtime by 30% without sacrificing quality. The executive board is thrilled. We're awarding you a $5,000 performance bonus effective immediately." The VP handed Brad a crisp, oversized corporate check. $5,000. Exactly 1/5 of the massive hospital bill currently pinned beneath the rusty magnet on Mike's refrigerator. Brad puffed out his chest, accepting the check with a smug, sickening grin. "Just doing my job, sir. It takes a real manager to step back and see the big picture." A few feet away, Mike stood in the shadows, leaning heavily on his mop. Next to him, William's eyes widened in sudden realization. The old man had seen Mike kneeling by the pallets earlier in the week. He had seen the chalk in his hand. He knew the absolute truth. William's weathered, calloused hands began to tremble with sheer, unrestrained anger. He took a heavy step forward, opening his mouth to expose the lying manager right then and there. Mike reacted instantly. He reached out and grabbed William's arm. His grip was iron-tight, pulling the older man back. Mike locked eyes with William and gave a subtle, desperate shake of his head. "Don't." God, Mike wanted to speak up. He wanted to march over, tear that check out of Brad's greedy hands, and scream the truth. But a single father doesn't have the luxury of pride. If he spoke up, Brad would instantly fire him for insubordination. If he got fired, he couldn't pay for Lily's life-saving inhalers. So he swallowed the bitter humiliation, forcing himself to stare silently at the dirty concrete. Brad thought he had won. But he had just set the stage for his own destruction. 3:45 a.m. the next day. The phone call that changes everything. Mike was sweeping the loading dock when his cheap prepaid cell phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor who watched Lily during his night shifts. He answered it on the second ring. He didn't hear a greeting. All he heard was the terrifying, ragged sound of a child gasping for air, desperately trying to pull oxygen into a closing airway. "She can't breathe, Mike. The inhaler is completely empty." "I called the ambulance, Mrs." Higgins shouted over the chaotic noise in the background. Mike didn't bother clocking out. He dropped the broom, sprinted out the emergency exit, and ran the 6 blocks to the county hospital, his lungs burning in the cold night air. When he finally burst through the sliding doors of the emergency room, The harsh fluorescent lights and the sharp sterile smell of rubbing alcohol assaulted his senses. He found Lily in a pediatric room hooked up to an oxygen mask and a heart monitor. The small digital screen blinked a steady red 110 beats per minute. Her tiny chest was rising and falling in rapid, exhausting intervals. A tired-looking doctor stepped out of the room holding a clipboard. "Mr. Turner, we stabilized her airway, but these severe attacks are becoming dangerously frequent. She needs a specialized steroidal treatment program." The doctor handed him an updated medical invoice. Mike stared at the bold printed numbers. $25,000. It was a suffocating, impossible mountain of debt. He didn't even have a credit card. He didn't have savings. Mike stood in the quiet hallway, his back pressed against the cold wall. Slowly, he raised the rough, worn-out sleeve of his gray jacket and wiped away a single tear that had escaped down his cheek. He took a deep, steadying breath, burying the crushing weight of his despair deep inside. He pushed the door open and walked into the room. His face immediately transformed. He offered a warm, reassuring smile. "Hey there, sweetie," he whispered, sitting gently on the edge of the hospital bed and taking her small, pale hand. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" she asked, her voice muffled by the plastic mask. "I've got everything handled. You just focus on getting better," he promised. He lied to his daughter and it broke his heart. But his nightmare at work was just beginning. The next evening, Mike returned to the massive Apex Logistics warehouse, his body heavy with exhaustion. He had spent the entire day sitting in hard plastic hospital chairs, barely sleeping for 2 hours before rushing to his midnight shift. Before he could even open his rusty locker, Brad was waiting for him. The floor manager stood with his arms crossed, a sickly sweet smile plastered across his bloated face. "You left your post last night, Turner." "Abandonment of duty," Brad sneered, his leather boots squeaking against the tile. "That's immediate grounds for termination." Mike froze. His heart hammered in his chest. "My daughter was in the emergency room. She had a severe asthma attack. I had to go. I don't run a charity. I run a warehouse." Brad shot back, stepping dangerously close. "I should fire you right now. But I'm a generous guy. I'll let it slide on one condition." Brad pointed his thick finger toward the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. The basement chemical storage. It was a hazardous zone, typically requiring an outsourced hazmat crew to clean. "You're going to scrub the chemical drains down there. Off the clock. Unpaid. You don't like it? You can walk out right now and find another way to pay those hospital bills." Mike's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He looked at Brad's smug, punchable face. The urge to swing his fist to shatter that arrogant smile surged violently through his veins, but he forced his hands to stay at his sides. He couldn't hit Brad. A man in jail can't pay medical bills. "Fine," Mike said, his voice stripped of all emotion. 10 minutes later, Mike descended into the damp, poorly ventilated basement. The moment he opened the door, a thick, toxic stench hit him like a physical blow. The sharp smell of industrial bleach and ammonia burned his nostrils and made his eyes water instantly. There were no safety masks provided. Mike walked over to a utility sink, soaked a cotton rag in cold water and tied it tightly over his mouth and nose. He grabbed a heavy bristled brush, dropped to his hands and knees on the cold concrete, and started scrubbing the toxic sludge from the drains. His lungs burned. His skin itched. His dignity was being ground into the dirt. Upstairs, Brad smiled, thinking he completely owned the broken janitor. But someone else was watching. At 6 a.m., the executive staff began filtering into the building. Jennifer, the CEO of Apex Logistics, was the first to arrive. She had barely slept, plagued by a growing financial discrepancy in the company's quarterly reports. As she walked past the service corridor toward the private elevators, she stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting on the floor outside the janitorial break room was Mike. He was slumped against the wall, fast asleep. His gray jacket was stained with dark chemical splotches. His face was pale, and his hands were red and blistered from harsh industrial solvents. But what caught Jennifer's eye wasn't just his physical exhaustion. Clutched tightly in his blistered hand, dangling over his knee, was a crumpled piece of paper. Jennifer stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She leaned down and gently pulled the paper from his loose grip. It was a medical invoice. She stared at the bold numbers at the bottom, $25,000. She carefully slid the paper back into his hand without waking him. A profound sense of guilt washed over her. The man who had once saved her college career was literally scrubbing toxic drains while drowning in medical debt. Jennifer marched straight to her corner office and slammed the door behind her. She bypassed her usual morning coffee and immediately pulled up the warehouse financial logs on her computer. She cross-referenced the maintenance budgets with the recent bonuses. The numbers painted a damning, undeniable picture. Just 3 days ago, the vice president had awarded Brad a $5,000 bonus for a brilliant routing algorithm. An algorithm Jennifer immediately recognized as the kind of complex mathematical optimization only a mind like Mike's could produce. But it didn't stop there. As she dug deeper into Brad's departmental ledger, she found ghost invoices. Over the past 6 months, exactly $50,000 had vanished from the janitorial supply fund, masked by fake vendor receipts. Brad wasn't just stealing credit, he was embezzling corporate funds. Jennifer's eyes narrowed. Her manicured fingers hovered over her desk phone. She was going to call the board. She was going to have Brad escorted out of the building in handcuffs and finally give Mike the respect and the salary he deserved. The CEO was finally putting the pieces together. But before she could confront Brad, all the lights in the building suddenly went red. 5:12 a.m. The system completely crashed. It was the morning of Black Friday, the single most critical day in the global supply chain. The Apex Logistics warehouse was supposed to be processing 100,000 packages an hour. Instead, a deafening, high-pitched emergency siren began wailing through the facility. Every single overhead fluorescent light instantly switched from a sterile white to a violent, strobing red. Below the massive automated sorting matrix, a sprawling network of high-speed conveyor belts and autonomous robotic delivery carts screeched to a brutal grinding halt. Tens of thousands of cardboard parcels instantly piled up on the stalled belts, crushing against each other. Inside the elevated glass-walled IT command center, sheer panic erupted. A dozen senior software engineers were frantically hammering away at their keyboards, sweat soaking through their expensive dress shirts. On the massive central monitor, a flashing error code pulsed relentlessly. Physical matrix error. Routing failure. The chief technology officer, a frantic man with loose tie, paced in front of the monitors. Jennifer burst into the room, her eyes wide. "What is happening?" the CEO demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Every second that belt is stopped, we are hemorrhaging money." The CTO ran a trembling hand through his hair. "It's a catastrophic bottleneck in Sector 7, ma'am. The autonomous carts are jamming at a specific junction, causing a cascading software failure across the entire grid. The code keeps rejecting the physical routing parameters." "Then fix the code," Jennifer ordered. "If we miss the morning freight deadline, we default on our retail contracts. That's a $2 million penalty by noon." "We can't just fix it," the CTO pleaded, pulling up a dizzying web of algorithms on the screen. "The software says the physical turn is mathematically impossible at current speeds. We have to take the system offline, rewrite the entire routing logic, and run a simulation. It's going to take at least 24 hours. Jennifer felt the blood drain from her face. 24 hours would destroy their quarterly earnings. It would tank the company's stock. The smartest men in the room were staring at the screen in absolute defeat. But the solution was outside, holding a squeegee. Outside the command center, standing on a short aluminum ladder, Mike was quietly washing the exterior of the glass walls. He had a bucket of soapy water in one hand and a rubber squeegee in the other. He could hear the frantic shouting inside. He paused his work and looked through the glass at the massive digital blueprint displayed on the main monitor. He saw the flashing red junction in Sector 7. Mike narrowed his eyes. He didn't see lines of broken code. He saw the physical layout of the warehouse floor, the exact floor he pushed a heavy cart across every single night. He knew that junction. The digital blueprint showed a smooth, sweeping turn. But in reality, a concrete support pillar had been built slightly off-spec, forcing the physical track into a sharp, rigid 90-degree angle. The software wasn't broken. The physical warehouse was. The automated carts were carrying too much velocity into a corner that was physically impossible to navigate without crashing. He promised himself he would stay invisible, but math was the one language he couldn't ignore. Without thinking, Mike dropped his squeegee into the bucket. He pushed open the heavy glass door and walked directly into the chaotic command center. His cheap gray jacket was still stained with toxic chemicals from the basement drains. The CTO spun around outraged. "Hey, who let the janitor in here? Get out." Mike ignored him. He walked straight past the frantic executives, reached out and calmly snatched a green, dry erase marker right out of the CTO's trembling hand. Mike stepped up to the massive glass wall beside the monitors. Without hesitation, he began to write. His hand moved with lightning speed, squeaking against the glass. He didn't write code. He wrote 7 lines of complex, terrifyingly precise physics equations. He calculated the exact mass of the carts, the friction coefficient of the belt, and the required deceleration curve to navigate the flawed 90-degree turn. He mathematically redefined the approach vector, changing the entry angle to 45 degrees to bleed off kinetic energy before the junction. He capped the marker and set it down. The entire room of senior executives and Ivy League engineers stood frozen in stunned silence, their mouths hanging open. "Input those new velocity parameters into the routing algorithm," Mike said quietly, his voice perfectly calm over the blaring sirens. "The carts are approaching too fast for the physical turn radius. Slow them down by exactly 14.2% 2 seconds before the junction. It will clear the bottleneck." He didn't just fix the code. He unknowingly proved a manager was stealing. 6 a.m. The sun was rising, but Mike's world was going dark. In the warehouse, the deafening sirens had finally stopped. The automated belts were moving again seamlessly, gliding packages through Sector 7 at a perfectly optimized speed. Mike's 7 lines of mathematics had saved Apex Logistics $2 million in a matter of seconds. But inside, Brad's office panic of a different kind was setting in. The floor manager stared at the glass wall where Mike's equations were still written in green marker. He didn't understand the math, but he understood the physical measurements. The equation proved undeniably that the concrete pillar at the junction had been built 2 feet wider than the approved blueprints. Brad knew exactly why it was wider. He had authorized the cheaper off-spec concrete mix and pocketed the difference from the construction budget. If those equations reached an auditor, he was going to prison. He had to eliminate the janitor. Now. Sweating profusely, Brad bypassed the standard chain of command. He logged into the executive portal and drafted a frantic, high-priority emergency report directly to the board of directors. Subject: severe corporate espionage breach. A newly hired janitor, Mike Turner, just bypassed the secure IT command center and manually manipulated the physical routing algorithms. The system crash was a coordinated distraction. "I suspect he is a corporate spy attempting to steal our proprietary sorting code. Recommend immediate police intervention and termination." 10 minutes later, Jennifer was sitting in her office, feeling a brief moment of relief that the warehouse was operational. Then her secure desk phone rang. It was the chairman of the board. "Jennifer," the chairman barked, his voice laced with cold fury. "I just received a critical security alert from your floor manager. You have an unauthorized low-level employee altering core operational code on the main floor. The legal team is terrified of a massive data breach." "Sir, you don't understand," Jennifer started, gripping the phone. "That man just saved—" "I don't care what he did," the chairman interrupted loudly. "This is a billion-dollar logistics network, not a science fair. We cannot risk our proprietary source code falling into the hands of a competitor. You are to suspend this man immediately, confiscate his access badge, and prepare the legal paperwork for the authorities." Jennifer's heart plummeted. "Sir, please give me time to investigate." "Do it now, Jennifer, or I'll find a CEO who will." The line went dead. Jennifer stared at the phone. She had the authority to fire Brad, but the board had the authority to fire her. And right now the board was operating on Brad's carefully orchestrated lie. She looked down at her desk. Her assistant had just printed out the HR suspension form. The termination stamp at the bottom was printed in bright, bleeding red ink. Brad had just played his final card, and it was a masterstroke of cruelty. 10 minutes later, 2 heavily built corporate security guards approached Mike in the hallway. Without a word, they gripped his arms and escorted him into a bleak, windowless interrogation room near the loading docks. Mike sat in a metal chair, bewildered. The adrenaline from fixing the massive matrix was still coursing through his veins. The door clicked open and Brad walked in holding a clipboard. He looked incredibly smug. "Well, well, well." The genius janitor, Brad sneered, tossing the clipboard onto the metal table. It was a voluntary resignation form, accompanied by a severe non-disclosure agreement. You really screwed up this time, Turner. The board thinks you're a corporate spy. They want me to call the police. Mike's eyes widened in disbelief. A spy? I just fixed your broken system. I saved this company millions. You altered proprietary software without clearance. Brad countered coldly, leaning over the table. That's a federal crime. If I make the call, the cops will arrest you right here in this room. Let them, Mike fired back, his voice rising in anger. I'll tell them exactly why that system failed. I'll show them the physical pillar you built off spec. Brad's smile vanished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing, venomous whisper. Go ahead. Fight me in court. You might even win. But let me ask you something, Mike. How long does a trial take? A year? 2 years? What happens to a man who gets arrested for corporate espionage? Mike froze. I'll tell you what happens, Brad continued, his eyes gleaming with sheer malice. Child Protective Services gets involved. They do a background check. They find a sick, asthmatic little girl living in a tiny apartment with a father who is now an unemployed suspected felon facing massive medical debt. CPS will take her away before the sun sets, Mike. She'll be in a foster home by dinner. It was a direct, lethal strike to the heart. Mike stopped breathing. The sterile walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in on him. He didn't fear a jail cell. He didn't care about his pride or his reputation. But the thought of Lily crying alone in a stranger's house, terrified and gasping for air without her father there to hold her hand, it broke him completely. Through the small window in the heavy steel door, Jennifer arrived just in time to see the exchange. She slammed her hand against the locked glass, shouting something Mike couldn't hear. But it was too late. Mike reached out. His calloused, blistered hand was violently trembling, not out of fear, but out of a deep, suffocating rage he was desperately trying to suppress. He picked up the cheap plastic pen. He could easily win the argument in court, but he would lose his daughter. He signed the voluntary resignation form. Mike stood up slowly. He unzipped his faded gray company jacket, peeled it off his shoulders, and threw it onto the metal table. It landed in a crumpled, wrinkled heap next to the signed papers. He walked out of the room without looking at Brad or Jennifer. A father will endure any humiliation so long as his child doesn't have to. Jennifer stood in the hallway, watching Mike's broad shoulders disappear out the main exit. The heavy glass doors shut behind him with a final echoing thud. He was gone. The man who had saved her career, who had just saved her company, had been forced out, like a criminal. Brad walked out of the interrogation room holding the signed papers like a trophy. Problem solved, ma'am, he said smoothly. The spy has been terminated. Jennifer didn't look at him. She didn't say a word. She turned on her heel and walked away. She wasn't looking for a janitor anymore. She was looking for blood. She bypassed her corner office and took the service elevator straight down to the basement locker room. The air down here was thick and oppressive, smelling strongly of black mold and harsh industrial bleach. The fluorescent lights flickered dimly. She pulled out the master override key from her pocket. She found locker number 42, Mike's locker. If he was truly a highly paid corporate spy, as Brad claimed, there would be flash drives, sophisticated hardware, or encrypted devices hidden inside. She inserted the key and turned it. The rusty metal door squeaked open. What she found inside didn't just clear his name. It broke her heart. There were no flash drives. There were no spy gadgets. Sitting on the top shelf was a single battered spiral notebook. Jennifer carefully picked it up and flipped through the worn pages. It was filled with hundreds of complex physics formulas, mathematical algorithms, and hand-drawn routing maps. Mike hadn't been trying to steal from the company. He had been quietly calculating ways to reduce the physical labor of the elderly cleaning crew. He had been using a genius-level intellect to help an old man push a trash cart. But it was the inside of the locker door that finally brought the powerful CEO to a halt. Taped to the rusted metal was a simple, folded piece of paper. It was a child's drawing, done in cheap crayons. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Written in clumsy, uneven letters at the top was, "I love you, Daddy." A single tear escaped Jennifer's eye, falling silently onto the cold concrete floor. She stared at the drawing, the crushing reality of Mike's quiet, desperate sacrifice washing over her. She wiped her face, her sorrow instantly hardening into cold, absolute fury. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she rarely used. "This is Jennifer," she said, her voice like ice. I need an independent forensic audit team down here immediately. I want every single supply invoice authorized by Brad over the last 2 years traced back to its origin. Don't tell the board. Don't tell anyone." She hung up the phone. 9 a.m. The reckoning. The morning executive briefing was in full swing in the grand glass-enclosed boardroom overlooking the warehouse floor. Brad was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, confidently delivering his status report to the senior management team. "The system crash this morning was unfortunate, but my swift action contained the threat," Brad boasted, adjusting his tie. "I've also identified the root cause of our declining efficiency. It's the elderly janitorial staff. Specifically William. He's too slow, too old, and creates massive operational delays. I'm recommending his immediate termination to optimize our workflow." The heavy double doors of the boardroom suddenly burst open. Jennifer strode into the room, flanked by 2 corporate attorneys and 3 uniformed police officers. The room fell dead silent. She walked straight to the head of the table and slammed a massive 3-inch thick binder down onto the glass mahogany surface. The deafening crack echoed off the walls. "That's a brilliant assessment, Brad," Jennifer said, her voice dangerously calm. "But let's talk about the real reason our workflow was interrupted today." Brad's confident smile faltered. "Ma'am." Jennifer opened the binder. "I just spent the last 3 hours with an independent forensic audit team. Over the past 6 months, exactly $50,000 has vanished from your departmental budget, funneled into dummy corporations." Brad's face drained of all color. He took a small step back, his hands beginning to tremble. I don't know what you're talking about. The spy Mike he must have." "Don't you dare say his name," Jennifer snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "He didn't steal anything. In fact, his 7 lines of equations this morning proved exactly what caused the crash. The autonomous carts jammed because you secretly altered the construction blueprints for Sector 7. You authorized a cheaper off-spec concrete pillar which severely narrowed the turning radius just so you could pocket the construction difference." The entire board gasped. The executives stared at Brad in horror. Brad's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His knees were physically shaking, barely able to support his weight. He looked frantically around the room, but found only disgust in the eyes of his colleagues. "You didn't just steal from this company," Jennifer continued mercilessly. "You blackmailed an innocent, desperate father. You forced a brilliant man out the door just to cover your own pathetic tracks." She turned to the police officers. "Take him out." 2 officers stepped forward, roughly grabbing Brad's arms and clicking cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The final officer reached out and violently ripped the corporate ID badge from Brad's lanyard. Brad was marched out of the boardroom in complete humiliating silence, his expensive shoes dragging across the carpet. The man who treated everyone like trash had just been taken out. That evening, at a cramped rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, the distant wail of police sirens echoed in the background. Inside Mike's tiny apartment, everything was strangely neat and perfectly organized, a stark contrast to the dilapidation outside. Mike was sitting cross-legged on a frayed rug, patiently holding a piece of white chalk and drawing geometric shapes on a small chalkboard. Lily sat beside him, watching intently, occasionally letting out a soft cough. A knock at the door. Mike stood up and cautiously opened it. Standing there, wearing an expensive trench coat that looked completely out of place in the poor surroundings, was Jennifer. She didn't bring any security guards. She didn't bring a secretary. She walked in her eyes, scanning the peeling paint on the walls, the massive medical invoice pinned to the rusted refrigerator, and finally settling on the chalkboard where a mathematical genius was teaching his little girl addition. "Good evening, Mike," Jennifer said, her voice soft but filled with profound respect. Mike instinctively stood in front of Lily. "If you're here about confidentiality, I already signed the papers." "I'm not here for that paper," Jennifer replied, stepping forward and placing a thick leather folder onto the small wooden table. "I'm here to tear it up." Mike frowned, looking at the folder. "This morning I fired Brad and handed him over to the police." Jennifer continued, looking directly into his eyes. "He embezzled corporate funds. You didn't do anything wrong, Mike. You saved my company, and I let you walk out that door like a criminal." She opened the folder and pushed a new contract toward him. "I didn't come here with pity," Jennifer stated firmly. "I came with an offer worthy of your intellect. The company needs a senior operations analyst. The starting salary is $45,000 a year." Mike looked at the contract, then back down at Lily, who was sitting quietly on the rug. "I can't work a full-time corporate schedule, Jennifer. She needs me." "That's exactly why there is a special clause." Jennifer smiled, a genuine warm smile. "You have absolute control over your working hours. You report directly to me. As long as the work gets done, you can come in late and leave early to pick up Lily. And Apex Logistics will cover her entire medical expenses and tuition starting today." Mike's heart stopped. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on his shoulders began to crack. He knelt down and pulled Lily into a tight embrace, hiding the hot tears that were spilling onto his daughter's small shoulders. Monday morning. The central warehouse floor. The janitorial crew was gathering before their shift, preparing for a grueling workday. William was tiredly inspecting his rusted trash cart. The double glass doors of the executive wing opened. Mike walked in. He was no longer wearing the faded gray janitor's uniform. He wore neat, unassuming business attire, walking with the confidence of a man who had reclaimed his dignity. The entire massive warehouse floor fell silent. The floor managers, the engineers, and the workers stopped in their tracks. Mike walked straight over to William. He smiled and held out his hand. The elderly janitor's eyes filled with tears. He reached out his calloused hands and firmly grasped Mike's hand, offering a nod of absolute understanding and profound respect. From her corner office, high above, Jennifer looked down and smiled. At Mike's new workspace, a clean, organized desk situated right next to the central dispatch hub. But on the desk, in the most prominent position, there were no framed degrees or corporate awards. There was a crayon drawing of a father and daughter holding hands under a bright sun, placed inside an elegant glass frame, and lying quietly right next to it was a cheap, worn-out plastic janitor's badge. We often judge a person's worth by the clothes they wear, the title they hold, or the car they drive. But sometimes, the most brilliant minds are quietly doing the most humble jobs. True intellect is never loud. It doesn't need to scream for recognition. And a man's greatest strength isn't measured by the money he makes, but by what he is willing to sacrifice for the people he loves. A great father will gladly drop to his knees to clean a dirty floor, just to ensure his child's world remains spotless and bright.